Welcome to Take Your Medicine podcast. I am Phil Cowley. I was a pharmacist for 25 years, thought I was brilliant at the beginning, and realized I didn't know as much as I thought I did. I learned that from listening to people that came in. My patients became my biggest resource for wisdom. And because of that, I decided it's time to spread the stories of those individuals out there who've lived real life experiences, give you wisdom in the healthcare realm that comes from real life experiences. And today we are so lucky. My favorite dietitian is here, Malina Malkani. She is brilliant. She writes books, she's on TV, and most importantly, she spends time with us. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. I always love talking with you. Always.
It's so much fun. Okay, so I'm jumping right in. I'm a Gen Xer and I have 4 kids. From the very beginning, I got told what not to give my children to eat. What do you think that's done to our kids?
Yep, such a good point. I am on the cusp of Gen X and the other one, the millennials, and I can really relate to what you're saying. Part of the confusion, I think, in the world of infant feeding and then in child feeding as well is that the guidelines have changed so much over the past 10, 20 years in response to new research. And what we used to think we knew about feeding babies has kind of done really a complete 180 especially with regard to food allergy prevention. So I'm kind of out there pounding on the table trying to raise awareness about this because if you have a baby right now, and let's say you have an aunt or a mom or someone who's helping you feed, and the last time they fed a baby was, 20, 30 years ago, what they know about feeding infants is going to be really different from what science now tells us we should be doing.
See, that's the thing I think a lot of people miss along it. When we talk about a lot of different health aspects on this podcast and other ones, it sounds like we're bagging on the health system. But really, what I believe we're doing is saying there was good, we learned more, and now it's better. And if we do it right, maybe one day we'll get to a point where there's actually best practice. But you have to be able to take everybody's opinion in on that. So grandma comes in, and it's funny because grandma will come in and say, we just throw things on their table and they were fine. And then mom will come in with advice like, oh, no, no, you have to start with rice and then you have to move to oatmeal. And now you're hearing someplace in between those two when we feed our babies. Is that right?
Yeah, you make such a great point because there's wisdom to be gained from every single generation, right? We can't throw out everything that our grandmothers and that our aunts know about feeding babies because a lot of it is great. And that actually reminds me of a really amazing story. I was just speaking with a friend of mine who has 3 children. We're the same age, and her kids are my kids' ages. My kids are 11, 13, and 15. So her oldest, when they were a baby, she was taught when she's from Africa originally. So she came here and so her aunts and her grandmother and her mother back in Africa, and they were saying, you need to feed the baby peanut. Peanut is a really healthy, nutrient dense, nutrient rich food. And, of course, you're not going to feed a baby a whole peanut, but you make it into a peanut butter and then you thin it out and you feed it to the baby, and it's really healthy.
Right. And I'm
And
thinking, oh no, we can't give
right?
babies like that's because of when I come through. I'm like, you can't do that. Like I'm
Oh,
almost freaking out. So,
yeah, I know. Right, right. And so was she, because she was saying, but my pediatrician is saying, no, you got to hold off. Don't feed peanut until 1, 2, and even 3 years of age. So she didn't feed her son peanut early on. And then at 9 months, when she did, when her, she finally listened to her grandmother and her aunts and uncles and everyone, and she fed the baby peanut and he reacted. And so it was really, so my whole point in this whole story is that pediatricians and healthcare providers 10, 20, years ago used to say delay the introduction of common allergens, but it was based on more of a hunch than on scientific research, not because they were wrong or bad, or we just didn't have it yet. We didn't have the research yet. And so I love that you said that because nutrition is a pretty new science comparatively, and it evolves, and that's okay. We need to be able to roll with that, but we also need to be able to spread the messages of this new research to newer generations so that they can benefit from what we know now. And there was I'm sure you're familiar with this study. It's one of my favorite studies in the world. It's called the LEAP study, the Learning Early About Peanut study from 2015. And it's such a great story. It was this group of researchers from the UK that were noticing that a genetically similar group of babies in Israel and in the UK had very different outcomes when it came to peanut allergy. And they were very similar in terms of genetics. But what it turned out to be was that the babies in Israel were fed something called bamba, really, it just was a very common weaning food. It's a little peanut puff that was just a really popular snack. And so they were getting early peanut foods in a baby safe form in Israel, and they had a much, much lower prevalence of peanut allergy than compared with the UK babies who weren't receiving this snack. So they looked into it, they did this research, and they found that early and consistent introduction of peanut foods to babies, starting at around, between 4 and 6 months of age, reduces the risk of peanut allergy by 86%.
That's
It's just a
crazy high. Like
food.
it's you're almost like cutting it to be gone. Like at that point, 86%, you're like very few. And
Right?
it's insane because I
Yeah.
think a lot of people think about it that what you want is like, okay, well, if we introduce it too soon, then the immune system is going to build. And we don't really, I don't think we've really understood the immune system and the way it develops until the last, I don't know, 15 years at best. And I think that's
I
one thing a
agree.
lot of people listen, they're like, well, I have to wait so the immune system has time. And they don't realize that's kind of the opposite thing we want because the immune system is like cement. As you go on more, it becomes more and more solid. Early, you can give them a lot more things in the immune system. You say, okay, this is part of what we do.
Yep. You're speaking my language, Phil. This is like music to my ears because that helps explain to families and reduce some of the fear around early introduction. Because a lot of families want to say, well, no, it's my little tiny precious baby. I don't want to introduce allergens into the immune system now because later they'll be more equipped to handle it. But actually, it's counterintuitive, but that's incorrect. The immune system is quite malleable during infancy. And so, if we can get those allergens introduced and train the immune system to know that these proteins are safe through the gut and through an oral route, then down the road, they're much less likely to develop an allergy to it. So, I'll die on that hill. I will thump the table with that message.
Before we go too far, I want everybody to know that there is a book. In fact, there's two books, right? Because the other one's on its
Yeah.
way. Now, this is important because what we need is we need references and resources. Now, tell them how you can find the book, and let's hear about your new book too, why we've got them,
You.
because I know we're going to keep talking and I'll forget to do it later.
You're so kind. Thank you. Yes. So I wrote Simple and Safe Baby Led Weaning in 2020. And back then, that was around when, it was right before the pandemic came out. And so it became a great resource for families who were kind of isolated and feeding their babies in an isolated way, where everyone was, we weren't connecting. We weren't being able to sit down over a cup of coffee and say, oh, gee, you can feed your baby avocado. Who knew? And so that was lovely. But as time has gone on, as more research has come out, as I've learned more and deepened more as a practitioner, I've really come to understand that food allergy prevention needs to be front and center in these conversations around starting solids. So I came out with, or I'm coming out with a new book in November called Safe and Simple Food Allergy Prevention. And it's a guide that has all of the foundational baby led weaning information in it, everything you need to know about starting solids. But it has everything about food allergy prevention too. So, a 9-day allergen introduction plan, which is quite flexible, 8 weeks of meal plans to keep those allergens in the diet going forward, and 80 recipes so you can just feed your entire family and know that the baby is getting the allergens they need to maintain that tolerance as well.
And where can they get it? Because this is
Oh,
always
sorry.
important.
Right. Thank you.
Got to be able to get a hold of it.
Thank you. If you go to foodallergypreventionbook.com, you'll find everything you need to know.
So, from your standpoint, there's been interesting patterns that have happened over the last 15, 20 years, which I think everybody's seen. We've moved from a few kids having allergies in the 90s, where it was kind of an uncommon thing, to
Mm,
where it seems like 1 out of 9 people have a peanut allergy. And not only that, but we're also seeing other food-based allergens, and we're seeing it in an adult age. But a lot of those had to have been started when they were much younger. We see a
mm,
lot more levels of celiac disease. It seems like my wife's got celiac disease, like every neighbor has
mm,
celiac disease. And for a while, I think people were thinking, are they making it up? Is this really a thing? And it's obvious now that it is really a thing because we're seeing so much sprue and we're seeing so many problems with the digestive tract.
yeah.
If you could go back in time, you have a Wayback Machine, and you went back to when these kids were younger, these adults now that are struggling with 8 different types of food, where would you start? Like, what's your starting
Mhm.
point for these individuals? If you had a machine, you're going back, you're going to go see their mom and say, okay, look, I know the future because I've been there. This is what we do. This is what we're doing wrong right now. If you went back to, I
Mm.
don't know, the mothers that just started in 2002 or 1998, what would you do different?
Yeah. So if I could boil it down to something super high level, it would be for families to understand that diet diversity during infancy is key. And that includes not just allergens, but all types of different foods. I think, in society, fortified rice cereal is known to be the most common first food for babies. And it's not bad, it's not a bad food, but it's not a food that's offering a lot in terms of nutrients or texture or flavor or a variety of different proteins, carbs, and fats, and all the different wonderful things that make up food. And it's so interesting because just diet diversity in and of itself, the infants that have a more diverse diet, and more research is needed on this, but the research that we have now shows that the more diverse a diet is in an infant's life, in the first year of life, the less likely they are to develop a food allergy within the first 10 years by a third.
Wow.
So that's just diet diversity. So instead of being so careful about just rice cereal, just bland foods, and just this, like a tiny little bit of something that's not a lot of variety during infancy, I would say just feed the baby, like feed the baby all different types of foods. Of course, we want to make sure they're in baby safe forms so the infant is not going to choke on the food, but the more variety, the better. So that's one. And then two, if I could take away the guidelines that said delay the introduction of common allergens until 1, 2, and 3 years of age. I wish that that had never happened because when that advice was kind of the overarching advice that parents were getting, we saw a 50% increase in the prevalence of food allergies. The development of food allergies is likely multifactorial, lots of different drivers, and we don't even really
Absolutely.
understand them all. But did that contribute? I mean, I think it probably did. I think it's likely that it did. Probably lots of other drivers as well. But if we could have turned that around back then, I think that would have been pretty awesome.
I think so too. I think all of that stuff is just such great advice. And one thing that we look at too is the safety of our food supplies because we had a very unsafe food supply back, I don't know, 1930, 1940. And so they made all these rules and helped to make them safe. And our food supplies now technically are safer than they've ever been from a standpoint of botulism and foodborne illnesses and how long we can preserve them. But there's always a trade-off. We traded one problem and we've now got a new one. A few months back, there was a big problem because there were heavy metals found in a lot of baby foods. But that's not, we said baby foods because babies make us go, oh no, not the babies. But
Right,
we
right,
don't,
right,
we
right.
haven't thought that, wait a minute, maybe I've been eating them for the last 40 years and the baby's only eating them shortly.
Yeah.
How do you feel like a generalized? I'm going to jump into this because a lot of people worry about food
Yeah.
supplies and you study food. So there's positive and there's benefit. I mean, there's negatives. Kellogg, like they're getting destroyed right now because of their food dyes. Like they're people are coming after them. But
Yeah.
this has always been a problem. So as a dietitian, is there any food supply things that if you could just say, okay, let's just get rid of this rather than pointing fingers at saying, okay, it's the big corn
Ugh.
cabal that's out there that's causing this, or like we're not going to do with conspiracy stuff, but you're like, okay, I don't understand. Like for me, most of the artificial colors, I don't understand why we even need them. Like the food was fine without them. You don't need a blue anything. There's no such thing as a blue.
Right.
Like it's not a great color. The bright pink's not something we need. For me, I would say, why don't we just not use food dyes? There's really no reason to use them, and there's no point. Is there anything that you look at like, oh, I just wish we would take that completely out of our food supply?
Oh, if I had a magic wand and I
That's
could
what I'm saying.
wave it,
You have the
I
FDA's
mean,
magic wand. You just get to go after
well,
it.
that's the problem, Philip, because the heavy metals in food, that's a problem with the food supply. It's not a problem unique to baby food. These little heavy metals, they're found in tiny amounts in the soil, in the water. And so I would need a magic wand because you can't just extract them. They exist.
Right.
So
There's technetium in the mountains that are above us. So right here in Utah, we have a high level of technetium that comes in our water supply. And technetium
yeah,
is really hard to remove. And we
yeah,
also use it as an agent to use as a radioactive component when we're treating cancer, but we have a high level. So I understand. Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, we can't just white wave it and have it be gone.
No, but what I tell parents who, especially every time there's a news story about the heavy metals in baby food or in the food supply, I get all these text messages and on my Instagram and DMs. And of course, It's a terrifying thought, but what I always go back to is variety. And
Hmm.
part of that is because when you're getting a variety of different foods, like different foods, yeah, they have different nutrients in them, but they also have different levels of contaminants in them. So, yeah, if you're eating one type of food over and over and over and over and over again every day, and it has one type of contaminant in it, yes, you're more likely to get more of that contaminant. But if you're eating a variety of different foods, then you're getting the spectrum of nutrients that'll help you fight against those contaminants, but you'll also get less of each one and less risk of toxicity.
Hair care was never really my biggest problem until it became. And now I found the difference between one product and another is huge. So what I listen to is you, my listeners and followers, what you like. Bonda Boost has never had a bad complaint given to me. I love the products that Bonda Boost have because people always love them. Don't you like a product you can just tell people to use and you know nothing's coming back to land on you? You know you can trust it. Bonda Boost, their HG product line, has been wonderful. That thick, full looking hair that you've always been looking for. But the best part is your scalp, your head, your hair will all love it. It will feel the way you want to. So go to bondaboost.com right now, use medicine 20, save a little bit money, and I don't have to worry about a thing because I know you're already going to love it.
So, variety is key for so many different reasons, for lowering the risk of food allergy development, for helping babies learn how to like and enjoy a wide variety of different foods so they don't end up eating one or two or three foods when they're toddlers. There's so many reasons why it's key. And when we can stay high level like that, I think it also takes a lot of the fear away from eating. And when we have fear and we feel shame and we're feeling like judged for every food decision, that can be just as detrimental, in my opinion, from an anxiety perspective and from a psychological perspective, as, well, I don't know if you can compare them, but it's also detrimental. We'll leave it at that.
Anytime you get fixations on foods, which most of us as adults have had times, like if you're really being honest, all of us have had fixations. A lot of those fixations on food come from a guilt and shame moment, where that guilt and shame then propagates, an ideal inside of our head, and then we start to. It's that anybody asks you like, "Oh no, no, I eat kale and lean protein, and that's it," and then at midnight you're eating 3 Twinkies at a time because and the thing about that guilt and shame, and it doesn't really matter which part of life you're in, guilt and shame, I really feel that guilt and shame are useless emotions unless we make lifestyle changes that allows us to feel good about ourselves, even
Yeah.
with food. And so it's been an
Yeah.
interesting, there's this bit of propagation of, okay, so you got to have to help me with this. It's avoidance restriction food eating disorder. Is that right?
Avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. Is that, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's the one. And
Oh,
what
hard.
basically happens is that we start, especially now in the age of information. So it's social media, but it's also friends. Everybody has it. These kids are hearing at a young age. A lot of our teenagers and even younger are
Oh, yeah.
hearing that that's garbage food. You have to only eat, you have to get 100 grams of protein. You have to like our kids are hearing these macro diets. What do you think's happening to our children when they're hearing these restrictive type things at such a young age?
Well, any messaging that attaches any sort of moral value to food is detrimental for children, in my opinion. That's actually it's one of the reasons why I love the world of infant feeding so much, is because, and toddler feeding too, they're new. They haven't been exposed to these messages yet. It's such a hopeful time in a person's life to be able to ground them with a really wonderful positive association with meal times and with food early on, so that as they age and they come in contact with these messages, they are so grounded in what they know about nourishing their own bodies that it doesn't touch them. That's how I have tried so hard in my life, Phil, with my three daughters to raise my girls, is for them to be so grounded in what they know about food and in, of course, there are certain foods that nourish us that have more nutrients than other foods. There are certain foods that give us a lot of joy. There are certain foods that we attach to memories, and they all nourish us in different ways. And so that's some of the messaging that I try to provide for them when they hear things like, that sugar is toxic, or that red food dye is, poison, or whatever it is. Striving for balance, an understanding of all the different ways that food nourishes us,
Yeah.
and we can enjoy all different types of food and be healthy.
Yeah, it
And
moves pretty quick to a negative food talk situation in our head. And a lot of people who are listening, and a lot of people that, like even myself, you look at yourself and you think, wow, I'm such a pig. I can't believe I just ate all of that. That's such terrible. And we do that inside of our head.
mm.
And with that negative food talk, where do you think that leads us anytime you have like that negative food talk inside your head?
Well, any sort of negative food talk, I mean, the first thing a lot of people are going to do is turn it inward and blame themselves. And then that guilt and shame can often start to spiral and start to then create cyclical problems where, in order to comfort yourself from that guilt and shame, you go and repeat behaviors that made you feel bad about yourself in the first place. And so that kind of guilt and shame spiral, that is really hard emotionally, psychologically, and then eventually it can be hard on the body physically. So I try so much to try and empower families to not attach moral value to foods and to actually that's one of the things that I love most about baby-led weaning as a method of starting solids, because what it teaches families to do is to offer a variety of different foods at regular intervals throughout the day to the baby, and then allow them the ownership over deciding whether and how much to eat. And what that does, this is also, it's kind of born out of Ellen Satter, who is a guru in the family feeding space. There's a whole institute that now is named after her and is based on her amazing work. But this division of responsibility between parents and children instills in children and babies from the very first few bites this very sort of strong internal ability to self-regulate their intake based on hunger and fullness. They start to recognize those cues. And I don't know if we talked about this before. I actually started my career as a dietitian at a VA hospital in the Bronx, and I
Oh,
was working in weight management and bariatric surgery. So I was kind of on the other end of the spectrum, people that had really struggled their whole lives trying to understand and be able to self-regulate and recognize when they're truly hungry and when they're truly full. And so to me, starting solids in such a strong and healthy and I don't like the word healthy because it's so subjective, but in an advantageous way for babies, that's strengthening that self regulation from the very first few bites is so hopeful. And it's a really wonderful. And by the way, I don't want to alienate any of the families and your listeners who spoon feed, because spoon feeding purees is a completely valid way to start babies on solid foods as well. And spoon feeding can absolutely be baby led when we are feeding a baby responsively. And what I mean by responsively is watching for the baby's cues for a readiness for a bite. So instead of like shoving in a bite when they're, looking at the dog or watching TV, waiting for them to open their mouths and lean in toward the bite. And that's indicating to you this baby's hungry and they're ready for the bite of food. And so I'm going to strengthen that. But
yeah.
when they purse their lips and shake their heads, then you don't shove it in when they're not looking. So,
I had zero success with green peas, like with every one of my kids. Like, I don't know why we always bought it. It was like we needed to add it. Like, you go in there and you're like, okay, this week we're going to take just one more, because that's how we were taught, right? And so we'd get the peas and they would not eat the peas. And then I tried the
yeah,
peas. I'm like, I don't understand why we're trying to give this to the kids. Like, this was, I don't know what they did to those peas, but they did not taste good, you know? Then you take a real pea and you'd squish it on a fork and you'd hand it to the kid and it would go down like seconds. So,
totally.
I don't know what Gerber did, but I know it didn't taste good. You know, there's some really good things like I really like about this. And one thing that I really look at is I think that kids learn a lot from their parents. So it's funny that you talk about babies because when you have your first child, you're very, 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 very concerned about keeping all the rules. By the third child, you're literally taking a bite that you have, taking a little bit off, and like a baby bird, you're just handing it to the child because you just don't have the time to put the effort into it. And it seems like that third child has a lot better palate. And it also starts teaching your other kids when you're feeding the baby, they see what the baby sees. If you feed the
Yeah,
baby just rice, your kids are like, let's just eat rice. When you start giving them a little bit of everything, your other kids are like, hey, I want to try that.
Oh yeah, it's so true. That's actually I think one of the strongest potential benefits of baby-led weaning is that it draws baby into the family meals earlier so that they're benefiting from that role modeling. And I saw this with my own girls. I have three girls and they were all born within about 3.5 years of each other. So we were doing a lot. I mean, it was like,
Wow.
it was
Yeah,
mayhem.
you don't
Yeah.
sleep, and when they get sick, it goes through the house, and then as fine as the third one gets well, it gives it back to the first one, and you start back over.
Totally.
Like it just goes
Totally.
round and round and round. And food time is insane at that point because somebody always is having a little bit of a fit, and you're trying to get it together, and your head's yeah. I
Totally.
remember.
I found a video the other day where I have no memory of doing this, but my little one was around 9 months, maybe 8 months. She was sitting in the high chair, and the 2-year-old was feeding her. She was like, giving her a little bit. And I remember I came in and I was like, well, can you actually like give it to her? I was like irritated with the 2-year-old because she wasn't doing it right. I look back at myself thinking, what was I thinking? But I cut my teeth on my oldest, who, as a 2-year-old, as a toddler, was quite difficult in terms of eating. Oh boy, she really taught me a lot about picky eating and about creating a positive mealtime environment where there was no pressure because it's so tempting when you've worked so hard, you've cooked this meal and you've gone out and bought it and got it ready and then put it in front of the kid and they don't eat it. It's really hard. It can be very stressful, but it's really when we're pressuring or bribing or cajoling or do all the things that we do to try to get a child to eat, that can actually end up strengthening and lengthening picky eating and making it dig in and stick around longer than it would.
Deer liver. My dad shot a deer, and I had to be like 6, and they were sure we were going to eat that liver. You know how many times I've eaten deer liver since I was 6? Zero. I won't even try liver. You put liver and onions, put it in front of me. I sat at that table. Like I think most adults have that time where like they sat at the table because you're going to finish it before you go to bed. And now that liver is cold. You're 3 hours in and you have drug your feet in. And you know what? I won't touch liver. I don't care what they do. I'm never going to touch another piece of liver my whole life. And I think that that's something their parents did. And like, we're going to make you so you won't be a picky eater. So they give you this thing. And now you've got an adverse idea
You're
in front of
killing.
you forever. Like, I'm just not touching it, you know?
You know what? Remember when you just asked me if I could take away something from back then? That's
Yeah.
one of the things. That's one of
That
the
you're
things. The
staying at
finish.
the table till you finish it.
Yes, the clean your plate. If I could tell you how many clients I've had that come to me who have issues related to food, and when we trace them back and the origins of them, it's because their parents made them sit there and clean their plate every time there was a meal.
See, and that's hard for really a lot of parents because we were always, we kind of come from this idea, and this is what they used to always say is that there's kids starving in Africa. Like you'd have something in front of you, and somehow you consuming that food will end world hunger. Somehow that's the solution, right? And they would tell you that, but then it creates this situation where the kid is full or their stomach's upset, or maybe psychologically they're not in a good place because they had a bad day. And now you've related psychological things, which is your parents are mad at you,
Yeah.
creating anxiety, and now you attach it to something. And people don't understand the way that we produce pathways in our brain has a lot to do with everything that's going on. We'll attach a food to a good time. Like for me, I smell a hot dog and I'm automatically someplace happy because they're all happy things that they have hot dogs. But I hate hot dogs. But if I smell it, I'm like, oh, I'm so happy right now, you know? And it's funny that we don't see as parents that we can do the opposite with the same thing with food. It's even as young as infants. If you're like, they're mad, they want to be held, and you're trying to shove food down their throat, they're going to have that next time's going to be harder, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And when you think about, if you're saying, well, you have to have that broccoli before you can get XYZ, well, then the child is going to say, well, that broccoli must be really terrible if I have to endure it before I can get to the food that I actually want. And then that gets sort of lodged in the brain. And then down the road, broccoli's quote unquote bad because that's the association that's been made. So yeah,
How
you make a
how many
great,
times do you have to like with your kids, I've watched a lot of your stuff. There was one,
yeah.
I swear it was watermelon with one of your children, but you had to introduce it like a crazy number of times, like 47 or 48
It's,
times before
it's, a
she would even
yeah.
touch it, right?
Yeah. Well, so research shows it's around like between 15 and 20 exposures. And by exposures, I mean neutral exposures. So not try it, try it, try it, try it. You have to try it, no pressure. Like 15 to 20 neutral exposures it takes an average of before a child will try a new food. and accept it. Sometimes it's way more than that. But Phil, there's this awesome study. I love this study. There's a few studies that I just think are so illustrative of all the different things that I'm trying to say and promote and help families understand. This one is wonderful. It looks at college students. So when they go to college, they've left the house, they go and they get their little tray and they're going through the line for, to get whatever food it is they're going to get. The study was looking at, what do they choose? They choose overwhelmingly foods that they were served in their home repeatedly growing up, whether or not they report having eaten them or liked them.
So it's just exposure. You show it to them.
Exposure.
And that's like hard on a lot of moms that are out there or dads, whoever's cooking the meal. So my wife yesterday was like, and she does this, and I know what to say. I say, honey, your food's so good. But she says, I cook and nobody eats.
Oh.
And I often tell her, there's a lot of things in life that we do over and over again that we don't realize that the people around us are paying attention. They're just not responding the way that we want.
Yeah.
Food, you're
like
telling me
parenting 101 right there.
Right.
You just described parenting in a nutshell.
You just keep doing it because, the response we want is that we take and you make this perfect salad with this perfect, and everything's green. You have all the colors on your plate. You did the whole thing. And then the kid comes in and they pick at the meat and then they get mad and leave. And you're like, okay, that was a complete waste of my 2 hours. But what you're saying is it's not a waste, even if they don't eat.
Not one bit. I say this so many times. Every exposure has value, whether the child eats it or not.
See, that's so good. It's huge. They also watch what we eat. So
100%.
Now that my kids are teenage boys, they eat just like I did. And so I came from a time where everything was like, you're going to clean your plate. So I have it's not just liver. I don't eat onions. I don't eat liver. I don't eat lots of stuff and I can tell you why I don't eat them. I can tell you the time that I ate this salad and then I threw up from food poisoning. And so now I won't ever try it again.
Yeah.
It's been unfortunate because my boys now eat like I do. It's either brown or starch, or they won't touch it because it's all meat and everything. And I thought to myself, I really wish I personally would have gone to effort when they weren't eating it to eat everything they weren't eating. Make it, because they watch us so closely.
Oh, they watch us so closely. But it's so interesting, Phil. We are, for our children, for our infants, for our toddlers, for our younger, like preschool, school age kids, we are their strongest role models when it comes to eating. Now, with tween and teens, now their role models are their peers and social media. And, so I think it's so important early on to try to ground them and give them that strong foundation and role model the behaviors that you want to see when it comes to meal times, because then it kind of gets a little out of hand for a few years and then hopefully they come back and then come back to their roots.
Yeah, I think that's such a big thing. And it's funny to me as parents how we work so hard for outcome-oriented results with our children.
Yeah.
We do A, then B happens, and then they'll turn into C. I'll give them the salad, they'll eat it, and then they'll be healthy. What we don't realize is it's often A and then D, and then they'll have a W at some, we just don't get it. And it's the consistency as a parent, because with the avoidance restriction food type thing, what we're seeing is kids that have anxiety that are being manifested through food. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
And then as adults, a lot of people, even in the adult pattern, although there are real allergies, what we're seeing is adults having anxiety about what their food's doing to them. And they're like, okay, now I've got to go on a strict anti-inflammatory diet. And they tell me this. I'm like, okay, I love the idea. But anytime you start restricting things like that and you become consumed with things like that, there is another side to it. Yes, maybe your food will get better, but now you've become fixated on something that can lead to guilt and shame.
Yeah.
When you see things like that, when you see people are starting to move into a point where it's becoming healthy eating, but with unhealthy psychological components, what advice can you give? Just generally, I know your thing is babies and all those things, but people, you've worked through the field. The listeners don't know how brilliant you are. I do know.
Oh, you're so sweet.
You've got this niche that you're in, but your brain is so much bigger than the niche they're in. What would you tell somebody? You're like, okay, I love that you're into this very strict, let's just say the anti-inflammatory diet, but these are my concerns just as somebody who's been in the business for as long as I have.
Oh, that's a big one, Phil.
I know. And if you don't want to, we can just not do it. But I really worry about people because Because I hate it when people start to lead into this control, guilt, shame cycle that you get into because
Yeah.
it becomes consuming. And it's one of those things where you just kind of want to give them a hug and say, hey, we're going to figure this out. It's going to be okay. But if we
Yeah.
go down this road, there are some potential pitfalls.
Yeah, where I always try to go is what does the evidence say? And that's really tricky because for a lot of these different issues that you're talking about, they're not well researched. They're not exhaustively researched yet because for a lot of these issues, they're so specific to the individual. And
Yep.
so working with someone who has a lot of experience in whatever, ailment it is super helpful.
I love
Sometimes
that.
working with teams, because sometimes it needs to be multidisciplinary in order to get to the root of the issue. It might be a food issue, but it might be actually something else. Maybe there's some sort of like a medicine supplement cross reaction that's happening, or like I mean, there's so many different things that could be going
So
on.
you're still talking, which I love, about exposure, making sure you look at the broad thing, looking at when you talk about kids, it's just like you have to continue, you have to have a lot of things, it's going to take time. And I love that on anybody, on any level, the idea that you're restricting too much and you're not giving them broad spectrum, saying, okay, it's all about balance, it's all about exposures, it's all about giving it time. I love that because that's really where I'm at on everything too. It's about a lot of things. There is no one singular answer to anything.
Isn't that so true? And so when we can sort of zoom back and say, what are the overarching things that I can
I
do
love
right
that.
now as a parent that are going to be most beneficial for my child and give them the best chance at not only a lower risk of developing food allergies, but also having a higher likelihood of having a positive relationship with food and feeling good about food and making healthy choices for themselves. What are those overarching things we can do? That's what's in this book. That is what I wrote in this book. And I want to say one thing, which is I wish this weren't the case, Phil, but food allergy prevention is not a guarantee. We can do everything quote unquote right and still end up with a food allergic child. And so any families who are hearing this and saying, well, I did all the things I introduced peanut and egg early and often starting between 4 and 6 months of age. And my baby had a diverse diet and still ended up with multiple food allergies. That's possible. So I just want to say it's not a guarantee, but we can greatly reduce the risk of food allergy development in how we feed our kids.
Most important thing you can be doing for your health later in life is obviously creatine and collagen. And here's the reason why. Lean muscle mass is the best indicator of how long we're going to live. The only problem you really have is finding a creatine and collagen that you trust. So, sports research has been around forever. They're an industry leader that you can trust. And the best part is they have the strictest guidelines on what kind of a product they'll use for both their creatine and their collagen. And of course, the best part is if you put in code Phil20, you get an extra percentage off. So put in code Phil20, save some money, and go right now to sportsresearch.com and get your creatine and your collagen. So, well, you can have a better, longer life. Well, and you can get them later too. So my peanut allergy didn't show up
Yeah.
until I was almost 40. And I was doing a lot of triathlons, a lot of running, and I was eating a lot of Cliff Bars. And then I was getting all sorts of cankers. And I just thought it was, I'm dehydrated, because you get those, right? And
Sure.
then one day I'm eating something with peanut in it. My tongue starts to swell up. And I was 41, 42 years old. But see, the
I
thing
didn't
that
know you had a peanut allergy. I did not know
yeah,
this
but
about
mine's
you.
like a topical dermatitis type thing. So I don't get the systemic as of yet, as of yet. So it starts out with my
Fingers
tongue and my
crossed.
mouth. My teeth feel tight. This is the way I always explain it. But then my tongue will get physically a little bit bigger, and then I get this
Yeah.
massive headache. But
Oh,
see, that all came, and it's probably because I was stressing out my body, consuming the exact same thing at the age of 40. So it's important to understand
yeah,
that it's food allergies aren't anybody's fault. What we want to do is take
yeah.
the path that gives us the least chance for food allergies,
Yes.
or even what we eat or how we view food. It's all about creating the best circumstance, because there are people who do everything right and their kids still turn up with bad food relationship situations, and you can't stop that, nor does it do you any good to take that on. But what I do
Absolutely.
love is the idea that we're now embracing a broader spectrum of what we should be doing. And the idea that we're not telling kids, so it's like, remember in the 80s, if it was fat free, you could just eat it. Like that was like a big trend in the 80s. Like it didn't matter how much sugar it had. had no fat, you're going to be fine.
Yeah, I do
Like,
remember.
and there was some evidence that was pointing towards higher levels of cardiac failure. And so we had good evidence
Yeah.
ish. We just didn't look at the broader picture, but it was
Or
like
what we were going to replace it with.
right. We didn't think that we're just going to put all sugar in there and get rid of all the fat. Like everything was fat free. The whole world
Right.
was fat free.
Oh,
And then
yeah.
we swung into, oh, no, no, you've got to eat all fats. Like it's just fats aren't bad. And it's funny how we had these swings. I love your take on things because yours is more of fats can be good and fats can be bad. Sugar can be good, sugar can be bad. It's what we're doing, how we're balancing it. And that is a way we should look at raising our children, I think, across the board.
Yeah. I love that you point that out. That really is what draws me to baby-led weaning, to a baby-led approach to all of this, is that it's not just about feeding. It's kind of a way of looking at parenting that you can extrapolate to so many different parts of parenting throughout the ages and stages. This sort of, here's the structure, and now I'm going to give you the freedom to make choices within that structure. And
You know, your daughters, when they start dating, the worst thing you can do is say, I don't like that guy, don't date him.
oh, goodness
Because he's
gracious.
going to come around. But, we
Yes.
do that with food similarly.
Yes. Oh my goodness. What a parallel you just drew. Yes, yes, exactly. Over restriction. This is such a great. So we're recording this right around Halloween. It's going to be Halloween soon.
Yeah.
That is such a great and important discussion around Halloween candy. If we say you can only have, a couple pieces of Halloween candy on Halloween and then throwing the rest out or donating it and getting rid of it, like, of course the kid is going to want to gorge on Halloween when
Or
it comes
hoard
to
it or go to
candy.
their friend's house and eat it all at
Yes.
their friend's house. Of course they are, right?
Yes, 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 absolutely.
So the
Restriction
idea is
has
saying
fueled
we're
that.
going to do some candy, but you need to eat some apples between the candy. We need to have some carrots in here. We'll say it's yours. I won't steal it from you, but it's funny because you see kids inside of adoption agencies that have been inside, orphanages in other countries. And one thing that you always see with those kids when they move over is food hoarding. And then that's the psychological component with that. And we have a lot of kids who we deal with on a psychological level when they come over. They struggle when they come in. So the pharmacist is involved. But
Mm,
we are now seeing similar type aspects with kids that, especially, we see a lot with boys where they're taking a lot of creatine and a lot of protein at young ages.
yeah,
And for me, I think that shows that we need a better way to train our children of how to eat healthy. When I go out and drink my 3 protein shakes for breakfast and I don't eat something, I think it sends a message to my kids.
yeah. Yeah, and it all comes back to balance, right? And I wonder, sometimes I worry that social media is making these messages about food that are extreme too available to our children. Where when you and I grew up, we had magazines, we had paper magazines, like we had, where else did we get our nutrition messaging? TV commercials,
We couldn't buy it even if we wanted to, though. Like you'd see it,
No.
but it's not like you could click 2 clicks and have it at your house. So,
Exactly, exactly, and you wouldn't get a whole explanation of it in
uh,
a 1-minute video or something. So I worry about that because there's just such a glut of these, and most of them are not from evidence-based sources or from anyone with credentials to be talking about nutrition and health. And so I worry about that a lot. And I think the more, again, like bringing it back to infants and toddlers, the more we can ground them in this idea and knowledge of the importance of balance and the importance of food as a source of nourishment for many different aspects of us as humans is so important, because then they're equipped to be able to handle those messages
yeah.
and deflect them when they say, oh, you know what, this person's talking about food being toxic and blah 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 blah, and so I know that that's a message that's so extreme that I'm just going to kind of tune it out of my frame.
And you learn that as an infant. And I love the fact that you're like, okay, do you start early? Because like, no, I like that. And that's good. Like all your friends will say, I don't eat it. And I love the fact that we are now realizing that our brains grow so fast when we're young that a lot of those ideals do stick in our brain and they never go anywhere. And you think,
Yeah,
I'll just wait till they're older. I'll explain it. And we're finding that waiting till you're older, that brain, it's already more plasticized. It's not as aplastic. So your
it
message
grows
is
so fast.
important. So tell them all the ways to find you, because this is where I would need everybody to go take a second to go follow her on Instagram. I need you to do this. She is brilliant in every way. So tell us all the ways to find you and where to find your book again.
Thank you so, so much, Phil. I appreciate it so much. I am on Instagram and TikTok at healthy.mom.healthy.kids. You can find my book at foodallergypreventionbook.com. And this is a starting solids and baby-led feeding guide to introducing allergens and everything you need to know about starting your baby on solid foods. It's got a 9-day flexible allergen introduction plan, 8 weeks of meal plans. So if you're somebody who just wants someone to just do all the thinking and planning for you, I have done that. It has 80 recipes that all have multiple top allergens in them. And we didn't talk too much about this, but it really is important. It actually may be more impactful to keep those allergens in the diet regularly than to try and hit any sort of a dosage, a specific dosage of that allergen, or
Yeah.
even just to introduce it. Like we need to keep them in there regularly. So those 80 recipes just make it easy for you to feed your whole family in foods that contain the multiple top allergens that your baby can enjoy too. So you can find this at foodallergypreventionbook.com. And I take some deep dives on some of you ask amazing questions, Phil, and I take some deep dives on some of these topics on my blog at malinamalkani.com/blog.
Will you
So
spell that for him? Because it's a little bit,
yeah,
the last name's a little tricky. So
it's terrible. I know it is. It's a terrible spelling. So it's Malina, and then my last name, Malkani, Malkani.com/blog.
awesome. Well, they're going to go look. Now, with the last question I always ask everybody, when I first started in social media, things kind of blew up pretty quick on me. And I had somebody tell me that if you're going to do this, you need to have an ideal, something you want to get out of this, a platform. And I thought a long time about it. I'm like, I want to make the world just 1% kinder. To switch the world all the way around is not possible, but we could lean the right way because it seems like we're leaning the wrong way. So my last question to you is, if you could make the world 1% kinder, what advice would you give people?
Oh, what a beautiful question. Well, we're also recording this about 2 weeks before our presidential election.
Oh yeah.
And
A lot of kindness gone out of that one. That one sucked us dry,
yeah.
hasn't it?
Um, I'll give you a little sneak peek. I'm actually going to go and post this in a minute. I have a post that's all teed up, but it's a picture. It's a simple picture of me holding up a sign on my front lawn. And what it says is, no matter what your politics are, we can all agree that food allergies are worth preventing.
Absolutely.
So I strive in this, and I think that's one of the reasons why our accounts are so drawn to each other. I try to strive to be a sort of centrist voice of reason in an area where there's so much binary thinking.
Yes.
And this is so important. If we can reduce the risk of food allergies and raise a generation of people that are less likely to be food allergic, it will be so helpful financially for families, psychologically, in terms of stress, nutritionally, in so many ways. So that's a topic that I hope that we can sort of, no matter what side of the ticket you're on, come together
Isn't
on
there a
it.
lot of those though? Like I love that idea of kindness coming from finding things that you have in common rather than focusing on things that you have not in common. I've always
Yeah.
found you can get along with anybody if you look for a reason. And that's what you're talking about. Look for a reason why we can get. I love it. I think it is
Aw.
awesome. You have been, of course, a wonderful guest. People are going to come find you. I can't tell you thank you enough. So if you like the podcast, give us a like, give us a follow, and come listen to more. And if you like what you heard, obviously you're going to go find her on Instagram and go find her book before it's too late.